Sanctions have been imposed on 82 individuals and 29 companies. German payment provider Wirecard went bankrupt on Tuesday.
Russia has launched an unprecedented disinformation campaign against...
Billions of dollars have been found in various offshore accounts.
Welcome to Integrity Insights, the Berlin Risk Podcast. Hello everybody, welcome to the 18th episode of Integrity Insights. Wow, time flies. Anyways, I just had a three-way conversation with two lovely guests. Elisabetta Marinoni, a policy associate at Transparency International here in Berlin, and Michael Hornsby from the Anti-Corruption Data Collective. The two just worked together on a detailed report about the state of the anti-money-laundering regulation in the real estate sector across 24 countries around the world. I think that they came up with some really interesting findings and were also able to highlight some of the main gaps in the regulation in this sector. I hope you enjoyed this episode. All right, Michael, Elisabetta, welcome on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Thank you, Philippe. Nice to be here.
I invited you guys to discuss a report that you recently published titled Opacity in Real Estate Ownership Index. We have a couple of those reports here in front of us. Before we dive into the topic, I think everyone is familiar with the Transparency International, but I think not necessarily with the Anti-Corruption Data Collective. Can you maybe lose a couple of words on this initiative?
Absolutely, yeah. So the Anti-Corruption Data Collective, or ACDC, was founded in 2020 as a way to bring together the different sets of skills and expertise that are really needed to do impactful data-driven research and investigations into corruption, kleptocracy, illicit finance, and the harms that those things cause in the world, particularly to our politics, to the planet, and to human rights and human security. So we bring together academic experts, investigative journalists, policy experts, and we work together to exploit public or private data sets to achieve our goals of data-driven investigations and research. Transparency International is one of the founding members, and they're a great example of the expertise and skill sets that we can draw on and the advocacy that we can draw on to try and create change with the work we're doing.
So you work very closely together, Transparency International and ACDC, as you call it?
Yeah, absolutely. So across this project, the OREO Index, but also quite a few other reports looking in depth at real estate or a particular sector in a given country, we'll work together on those reports.
And on a very general level, why do you think it's important to measure such indices?
Investigations after investigations and media reports showed that real estate is still a vehicle that is mostly used by corrupt individuals and criminals around the world to launder their ill-gotten gains. So that was the main reason. And when we started thinking about how to develop this index, we asked ourselves, which are the kind of ways or solution to tackle the opacity around this sector, and to make this the real estate sector less vulnerable to this kind of crimes. And we came up with these two pillars that the index is composed of. On one side we have the data pillar, and on the other side we have the legal one. So we think that in order to, as I said, to tackle the vulnerability of this sector, you need on one side open, available, and complete data ecosystem, and on the other side, you also need to have, of course, a strong and robust and comprehensive, most of all, anti-money laundering framework. So, hence the importance of these two pillars.
And you looked at if I'm not mistaken, 27 countries, right? Why did you choose those countries specifically?
I think it's 24, but it's the starting point was the G20. So we cover the G20 apart from Saudi Arabia and the EU as a whole, but we do include some European countries that are frequently part of EU discussions, like Spain and Norway. And then we added a selection or a sample of what we think of as offshore financial centers. So Hong Kong, Singapore, Panama, and the UAE, because we wanted to see how those jurisdictions, real estate sector aligns or matches up with their maybe more secrecy friendly or the risks that we see in their financial sectors. But as we will see when we get into the results, it's quite a mixed bag in terms of how they perform on the index. It isn't necessarily what you might expect. A lot of the time their performance is actually comparable with the G20 economies.
So speaking about the result, I mean, this is obviously like a very big question, but is there a way to kind of briefly summarize like your main findings?
So I think the first thing to say is no country or jurisdiction is getting 10s across the board here, right? There's no perfect score. One of the things the index does is define the ideal framework, both on the data side, but also on the AML framework side. So it sets up what we see as the ideal standard, and there's no country that we looked at that is really achieving that. There is a very mixed bag in terms of, some being stronger on the data side, some being stronger on the legal framework side, and a lot of variation and kind of fine-tuning, let's say, within those countries. But generally, there are a lot of loopholes that we see. So across the board, there's nearly always, I think, in every country, a few areas that stand out as being a gap in the way that the legislation is written, the way that it's implemented, or in the data framework that creates an opportunity for dirty money to enter the real estate sector, avoiding the scrutiny that could be there if that gap or loophole was closed.
Do you think, by the way, that this is intentional or just like a lack of, maybe foresight?
That's a great question. I think we have to assume good intentions on the behalf of policymakers. I think they're trying to put in place a framework that works and is effective. There are international standards as well that set some guidance for this. From what we can tell, often it's just in the actual implementation and matching those standards and that guidance to the situation in that given country where these gaps appear. There may also be cases where the authorities aren't particularly interested in closing those gaps. There are some countries where we see that secrecy in this sector isn't really being tackled, even though there's plenty of evidence and plenty of opportunity to do so. So it's a mixed bag. I think in general we'd assume, looking particularly at this selection of countries, that they've all signed up to international standards through the G20 or through their FATF evaluations, and they've shown good intentions, but there are still gaps that appear for sure.
Is it possible maybe to, like when you say there are certain countries where they just don't really prioritize this, to regionalize this, to think of this in terms of regions? Are there some parts of the world where we can say that in general this is not really like a priority?
I wouldn't necessarily say so, but I think there's been a lot of focus on global north destinations of illicit finance flowing into the real estate market. Also in the journalism and in the research and investigation from civil society actors, I think there's increasing awareness of how these risks also manifest in the global south, in particularly tourist hotspots. There's some really interesting research I heard presented by some academics recently, where they were looking at exactly this question, and they identified, similar in a way to the OREO Index, that the variety between ways that real estate markets work in different contexts creates different gaps and loopholes that aren't necessarily covered by the international standards and their implementation international law.
And you mentioned those loopholes that you see across the board. What are the kind of like the main loopholes that you've identified?
So I think that one of the main loopholes that we identified is that beneficial ownership information is not collected in most of the countries. And when I say most of them, it's really the majority. We just found a couple of countries that actually collect this kind of information. This means that when you want to buy a property and register that, you are asked about the legal owner. So in case you are buying the property through a company, you will put down the name of the company, but nobody is going to ask you, okay, but who is ultimately behind this company? So this is a very important loophole because nowadays we showed that real estate properties can be held anonymously. And this, of course, remains a really big incentive for money launderers who want to put money into the real estate sectors. It's not just the high value transactions that the real estate sector allows you to do in one time, but it's also what makes it attractive is that you can help company in anonymity. So it's really concerning.
So Elisabetta, if I understand this correctly, basically from like a perspective of journalists or investigator who are trying to like find out who owns places, apartments, houses, this means that since this is not mandated that you have to disclose beneficial owner, the only way to find out is that if the country has a beneficial ownership registry that is accessible to everyone, and then you can like look at the legal entity that bought the apartment and then go, but this is not always the case, right?
Yeah, it's not always the case, and this is actually a very interesting question because it raises another problem, which is, first of all, the data is not always interoperable. So this reasoning that you are correctly saying might work for one entity if you're interested in one entity. But if, let's say, a journalist or a civil society organization is interested in defining and drawing out a pattern on, like, I don't know, like looking at multiple properties owned in a very specific country, you can't do that because data is often not open. And the other side is that we found that in the countries we assessed, so in 24 jurisdictions, I think around a couple has right now a beneficial ownership register opened to the public. So even if you retrieve the name of the company owning a real estate property, sometimes you just stop there because you don't have access to beneficial ownership information held in another register. So I mean, this
is a very interesting point, and it just made me think of I have this example, like I come from Prague, which is a very hot real estate market, and there's this kind of like this perception I feel like among people when I talk to family members or friends. A lot of people say, that's all because the prices have been, skyrocketing recently, and there's this perception that it's all like Russian oligarchs buying these places, but essentially there is no way to find this out, right? Because as you just said, there is no way to like mine data from these registries to kind of establish some patterns.
Well, I think one of the challenges and one of the loopholes that we see is that in a lot of jurisdictions, a foreign company doesn't need to have a domestic presence where it would then be required to disclose its beneficial owners. So if a foreign company is able to buy property in a country without having set up a local entity or declared its beneficial owner to the authorities in that country, that creates this gap where you then have to hope that you can trace it back to the country of incorporation and their beneficial ownership transparency regime, which these gaps and these steps all create obstacles and opportunities where not just journalists and civil society investigators, but also the authorities themselves can run into problems of mutual legal assistance requests that go unanswered or take a very long time, or just inability to work with partners where there's perhaps a relationship like, say, between the EU and Russia, where it's very difficult to get that information out of the authorities there. So, if not impossible. So, what we see is that these are the kinds of loopholes that appear and just kind of become obstacles to scrutiny. And when we're talking about the data frameworks, it isn't simply the openness and ability of the public to engage. The first thing that we look at is, are the authorities themselves collecting all the information that they need to conduct their own investigations if, for example, there's a suspicious transaction report flagged by an obliged entity. That isn't necessarily the case across all these countries. There are some where you can avoid registering a transaction or your ownership of a property with the authorities in their register altogether. So those countries tend to score pretty poorly because we say that, look, if there's a way where you can hide that information or keep that information from the authorities, then whatever else you're doing and however beautiful your register is and however much access people have to it, it doesn't really work very well because there isn't the complete information there in the first place. There are these other gaps as well. So in some countries, you don't need a third party to validate a transaction, such as a notary or a lawyer. So there's a kind of oversight gap that creates. Or you can use cash. You can operate outside of the banking system, so you avoid the other AML controls that exist within finance.
Is this a lot of countries where you can pay in cash?
I believe so. I think that you might have this more off the top of your head.
So like we didn't really directly look at like the means of payments accepted for real estate transactions in the index. But when we found out that in some countries, like Michael was rightly saying before, you don't need a regulated professional to certify the transactions, we kind of looked a little bit more into which countries, like a sample of countries that, because if the payment still needs to go through a bank, then at some point you will have some kind of control because the bank still needs to do some checks. The problem is with countries that allow real estate transactions to happen in cash. And we found, for example, Australia and Russia, this can happen. So Australia and Russia are two countries that you don't need a third party to validate the transactions, like a lawyer or a notary that finally certified that the transaction happened, and you can buy property in cash. So that means that I can come to you, just give you a bunch of cash, and the property is mine. We're not saying that this is a common way, like of launder money, like the fact that it's not like there is not evidence that the fact that there is no third-party control is a big loophole used yet, but it's a loophole that can be potentially used. And of course, it gets risky if the transaction can happen in cash.
And how about these mediators, like real estate agents and developers? Do they have some sort of face some sort of regulations?
So it's a really interesting question. The straightforward answer is yes. We found that 22 out of 24 countries that we analyzed in the report kind of extend some kind of obligations. The two countries that don't at the time of writing the report were South Korea and Australia, although Australia already in 2024 passed a legislation that will include some professionals. I think it's going to be effective in 2026. But coming back to the ones that do extend some kind of obligations, if we look closer, we found that some categories of professionals are not included in these obligations, or that in some cases these obligations are not implemented evenly. Let me give you an example of that. For example, one of the main finding is that real estate developers are often not included, don't have any anti-money-laundering obligations, even if they can sell real estate properties or housing projects, and this was the case in 7 countries. So if you think about like 7 countries out of 24, it's a pretty high number and creates a very important loophole. And the same line, when I was talking about like uneven implementation, we see the legal professions in some jurisdictions like Canada and Brazil. Legal lawyers and legal professionals are exempted from, are not included in the national anti-money laundering legislation. For example, in Brazil, the Bar Association was supposed to give some obligations to lawyers, but it never happened. And in Panama, we have the example that lawyers can abstain from reporting suspicion transactions because of the client privilege, which is applied also for high-risk services like setting up a company or even buying a property.
This leads me to my next question, which is the question of enforcement. I know that you didn't really focus on this that much in your report, but I found interesting you have this example of, I think, Germany, where there are over 300 different supervisory bodies, which sounds like a complete nightmare. Can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Yes, we looked at supervision as the fourth component of our legal pillar because it's extremely important that these obligations don't remain on paper, that they are actually checked and see if they are actually applied. One of the main findings in this component, as you are rightly saying, is that supervisions in many countries, Germany was the extreme example, but it's oftentimes fragmented, and so supervisory responsibilities are spread across multiple entities and other supervisory authorities. Germany was not an isolated case. Also, Brazil has different kind of supervisory bodies. That was one of the main findings. The second one is that in some countries, supervision is still entrusted to self-regulatory bodies, which is kind of risky because of it raises, of course, concerns about client conflict of interest. Of course, if the association of your own profession is called to kind of regulate and impose sanction on their peers, it raises a question of how are you actually doing that without, So it was another topic that raised concern, the supervision.
And on this point of Germany, since this is where we are, as far as I know, no publicly, the property records are not publicly available, right?
That's right. Yeah. So that is a major weakness in the system.
But it's still ranked really high.
Yeah. So that lack of data openness is a major weakness in the German system. But one of the reasons I think for its good performance on the index is that it's one of only 4 countries in the entire sample that covers all of the professionals who can participate in real estate transactions with the anti-money-laundering legislation. So for the majority of countries where there's some kind of gap in that coverage, that reduces their entire score across that part of the index, because from the get-go there's a professional category of professionals who you could work with to purchase real estate and avoid triggering reporting requirements. In Germany, that doesn't appear to be the case, so it's strong in that sense, but weaker on the data side for sure. And supervision, as Betta was saying, is very fragmented, and that's a significant obstacle to a smooth investigative process to look into cases and hold people to account.
And the country that, as far as I remember, is ranked the highest is South Africa, and which one was the worst?
South Korea.
South Korea. Okay, so it's the South countries. Is it like a huge gap between those two in terms of all the indicators that you measure?
Yeah, actually, it's in the index. It's Australia that is right at the bottom. But as Betta was saying, because of the new legislation coming into place on paper, that'll change pretty soon. It is a really significant gap. I think the difference between how these laws are written in the different countries and the data that's available makes an enormous difference if you're trying to look into this sector, and makes a big difference to the professionals who are working in it. I think it is important when we talk about South Africa, and actually any country in the index, to mention that we are only looking at the legislation as it's written, not how it's implemented, so or not how it's followed and enforced. So there are examples from South Africa that really great organizations like Open Secrets South Africa have reported and documented, where you have people linked to kleptocratic regimes across Africa buying South African real estate and doing so successfully, bypassing the checks that are there at the point of transaction, and later appearing in investigations by law enforcement or civil society that are triggered through some other means. And that speaks to this point of making these systems work and bringing up the numbers of suspicious transactions that are being flagged by professionals in the sector, which I think is a kind of perennial challenge for FIUs. But it also speaks to why we look at the data part, because what we see is that when we have that open data, when we're able to look as independent actors, then we can identify those cases, but also see the loopholes and see the gaps, so that we can flag those up to the authorities and say, look, this is clearly a problem, or your very good on paper legislation is falling down because of these 2 or 3 points that we see being abused time and time again. And that feeds into the civil society advocacy that can help kind of bring these numbers up, basically. So this is part of why we wanted to look at both parts, because it isn't just what the authorities can do with the data that they have, but how we as civil society actors, academic researchers, can get involved and identify, by looking at scale, what the situation is within the sector.
And then one more question I found interesting, that you had in the data set several global financial centers, such as I think there's the UAE, Panama, Singapore, Hong Kong. How do they kind of rank, and do you see like similarities between those countries?
So they do fare surprisingly well, I'd say, in the index. Although on closer inspection, I think what you see is that they actually have quite different business models, right? So Singapore performs very well in the index, and we see that Singapore is this major finance hub for the region and takes quite a strong interest in keeping criminal elements in check. Similar in Hong Kong, although it has a weaker beneficial ownership disclosure and identification system, so maybe there's a greater level of comfort there with anonymous companies and therefore their real estate holdings within Hong Kong. The UAE performs pretty badly in the index, and that's very consistent with what seems to be the business model there as this offshore hub where it's kind of all services, everything included, low tax, high anonymity, and that extends to the real estate sector. There have been leaks of real estate ownership from Dubai that show a real kind of who's who of criminal underworld and corrupt characters purchasing real estate there, often very anonymously. And there are cases that are in the news at the moment, like this huge seizure of crypto from the UK. I think it was £5 billion, about 6 billion euros. And the fraudster behind this scheme, through an associate, successfully bought real estate in the UAE, and it was actually their attempt to buy it in London by some multi-million-dollar mansion that tripped the SAR reporting requirements from lawyers, and then the police got involved in the case. So it also shows how real estate becomes a bit of a choke point for all kinds of illicit crime and activity, where a country that's well set up to combat this can protect itself from these kinds of criminal elements, whereas a more doors wide open policy obviously becomes very attractive.
And if I may add to what Michael said, that they all have something in common, that is that the data pillar scored less than the legal one. And this talks a lot about what the point that Michael was making before. I mean, you can have a legal framework that is really strong and robust, but like if your data is not open, if you're not allowing other actors and public watchdog to check what you're actually doing, who is holding the properties that you have in your country, and raise suspicious transactions, that you're just halfway through prevent dirty money to enter your economy. So I think it's also a very important point to raise.
I will ask you one more question. It's a very a broad general question. Maybe you have some thoughts on it. I remember recently I interviewed this researcher in the US where he was talking about how all these anti-corruption laws are being kind of scaled back across the European Union. We have been seeing the closures of transparency UBO registries. So the trend is not really in our favor, from our perspective as anti-corruption practitioners. Do you see a similar trend in terms of transparency in this field in real estate, or how do you kind of foresee the future?
I think that what's missing still in general in the global discussion is a consensus around the importance of beneficial ownership data on real estate. And I hope that this will change in the upcoming years. We have the 6 anti-money-laundering directive that might address this in the EU a bit. But yes, it's concerning that we still, after all the discussions that were held in international fora and so on, that this topic didn't reach a consensus yet. So I think if we don't even get to that, it's might be a concerning future.
And I think where we do see quite strong and clear international standards around AML legislation for the real estate sector and other non-financial entities, the framework or the broad consensus about the data availability and going back to the basics of what's collected, in what circumstances is information collected, there isn't such a strong international agreement around that, and that dovetails very much with what Betta's saying about beneficial ownership, but it also extends further into the real estate sector in general. So I think there's maybe less of a rollback scenario as we're seeing in terms of beneficial ownership, but there isn't perhaps as much to roll back actually in terms of real estate, in terms of getting the clarity about what's going on in the sector there.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much, Elisabetta, Michael, for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been a fascinating conversation, and maybe we'll do an update when there's some significant developments in a couple of years. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.